the age of 30, Patsy Cline passed away on March 5, 1963. Her death cannot be attributed to a single accident, but it is too early for her to become a fully realized legend. Everything ended in a matter of seconds when the jet crashed into a woodland close to Camden, Tennessee, in bad weather. A sense of incompleteness was left behind, as if a voice that had just found its place was abruptly driven into quiet. There was no farewell, no final night planned ahead of time, and was just an abrupt cut. She was at the height of her career just 2 years prior. The song, "I Fall to Pieces," reached the top of the charts. Crazy helped her break through the barriers of country music and become a mainstream artist. Her recordings reached a level of maturity she had been striving for almost 10 years, and major stages started to open. For Patsy Cline, success did not come easily. It came after a protracted period of self-correction, deception, and constraint. Her voice was no longer being suppressed in the traditional ways at that precise moment. She started to lose control of the remainder of her life. From one trip to the next, she was accompanied by arguments. The areas that were supposed to be used for rest were filled with alcohol. Her body never completely recovered to its state following the 1961 car accident. The performance schedule was still jam-packed, though. The journeys, the recordings, and the music continued as if nothing had to be changed. The life beneath Patsy's voice lacked the same solidity, but she managed to keep it just where it needed to be, and everything ended in that energy of continuing. Instead of a malfunction, the flight started with a choice that disregarded pre-existing warnings. After departing Kansas on March 5, 1963, the aircraft made a late afternoon stop in Dyersburg, Tennessee, when the weather had obviously gotten worse. The airport management recommended delaying the aircraft overnight due to low clouds, poor visibility, and strong gusts. However, the offer to switch to ground transportation was rejected. At roughly 6 p.m., the pilot, who had only about 10 months of experience and was not certified for instrument flying, took off in the quickly losing light with almost no forward vision. The airplane left the ground and flew directly into a layer of low clouds where it was impossible to see the horizon. Control was now dependent on sensation rather than visual reference. The airplane started to bank without being corrected in time, even though that feeling can quickly become deceptive in the absence of a fixed point. The fuselage descended more quickly than it could be controlled as the deviation grew, changing from a slight misalignment to a distinct downward angle. The rest happened in a matter of seconds, and by the time it was identified, the bank had surpassed the amount that could be recovered. There isn't enough time to get the aircraft back to a stable state. The next morning, the accident site was discovered close to Camden, Tennessee. Mechanical breakdown was ruled out by evidence that the engine was still running at high power at the time of collision. The airplane did not land under control. Instead, it plunged straight down in a state of total loss of control at the initial point of impact, which was at the tops of trees with a steep downward angle. There was no indication that an emergency landing attempt would be successful, and no unexpected factor materialized at the last minute. What happened was the direct result of choosing to take off in inappropriate conditions, which continued for a brief flight before any necessary corrections could be made. Nashville did not receive the news that same evening. Lights continued to be on, and local lines were congested due to constant phone calls. Not only was there no official confirmation, but the aircraft did not communicate. The waiting period was neither clear enough to accept a conclusion nor long enough to generate hope. The following morning, the location of the crash was verified. Friends rather than reporters were the first to arrive at the scene. Roger Miller joined the hunt, shouting out each name as he ran into the woodland. There were no signs of life when they arrived at the wreckage. There was no interval between the accident and its resolution, nor was there a rescue period. Official remarks did not reflect the opinions of those in her immediate vicinity. After hearing the news on the radio, Doy West, who had personally treated Patsy's injuries following the 1961 car accident, was one of the first people to arrive at the scene. Later on, Loretta Lynn claimed that this was the first time she realized how swiftly a career in music may end. Although those responses were unplanned, they were sufficient to convey the abruptness of the loss inside a community that was still actively progressing. The body of Patsy Cline was brought back to her hometown of Winchester, Virginia. A few days later, the funeral was held, and more people showed up than could accommodate. The event was unable to keep its customary order as the audience overflowed outside. There were listeners in addition to family and co-workers. Even though they had never met her, they instantly recognized that voice. In the days that followed, the media concentrated on the disruption rather than the crash's specifics. A voice that had achieved stability was halted in the middle, leaving behind unreleased recordings and no further development. The section that was cut off in the middle did not start with a solid base. In 1932, Patsy Cline was born in Winchester, Virginia. My family moved around a lot as a result of her father's temporary employment. Stunton, Norfolk, Winchester, Elton. Each location only existed for a short time, long enough for adaptation but not long enough for attachment. Instead of creating distinct turning points, these actions added up to a familiar situation where people had to get used to a new location before settling into the old one. The rhythm of change was the only thing that persisted. No space was maintained long enough to become a fixed point. Her father abandoned the family in 1947. Instead, then causing an abrupt break in daily life, the absence left a long-lasting void. There was no longer a single source of revenue. The children began working early to supplement her mother's constant employment. She worked in shifts at a poultry processing facility in Elkton during this time, handling chickens and plucking feathers. A monotonous, long-hour job with few options. Sales positions in neighborhood stores followed, where time was defined by work shifts rather than long-term ambitions. Although these jobs supported everyday existence, they did not generate possibilities. She did not finish high school. There was no predetermined course of action when she left school. There was no training program, no mentor, and no direct link to the music business. During this time, a rhythm of life connected to labor and responsibility, where every decision had to be made within the constraints of the current circumstances, formed rather than performance skill. This lacked the components that are frequently thought of as preparation for an artistic career. When Patsy Cline was still a teenager in the middle of the 1940s, a problem affecting her heart rhythm and throat forced her to take a long break from music. The singing was totally cut off by. The days that followed were spent in the hospital, where time was monitored hour by hour instead of being connected to work or school schedules. Her respiration had to rely on medical help for a brief while, long enough to interfere with everything that had previously been in motion, and her voice was nearly completely lost. Her voice did not return in the same manner when she left the hospital. The music lost its accustomed brilliance and grew thicker and lower. The mid and lower ranges held longer and were more easily sustained without much effort, while the high notes became challenging to obtain. The melody and melody of the songs she sang later remained the same, but the way they were delivered changed. They were slower, heavier, and contained more space between phrases. There was no discernible phase of adjustment to regain her former voice. The employment of this new vocal characteristic persisted in later performances, initially in churches and later in public settings. It existed as a modified state that was only maintained rather than being molded by official training or methodical practice. Later, when she went into the recording studio, that same tone became something that was nearly unaltered without having to be changed to meet any technical requirements. From that point on, music developed informally. Singing in church with her mother was the initial step, followed by taking part in neighborhood activities. When she was 15 years old in 1948, she went to the Wink radio station in Winchester by herself and requested the opportunity to sing. There was only a straightforward request in an unusual setting and a voice performed in front of people who had never heard it before, without any prior introduction or sponsor standing behind her. Although there was no instant shift as a result of those initial broadcasts, they did mark something: the capacity to enter a new area and keep her presence there. Patsy Cline did not retreat from the microphone in the conventional sense following her debut on Wink Radio in 1948. She went back to doing live broadcasts with in front of an error-free on-air signal. She performed a whole song in one take. There was no barrier between the singer and the audience, and there was no chance to make any corrections later. She transitioned from the radio industry to local contests, makeshift music stages erected in public spaces, and brief, dispersed musical performances where people came and went without having to know the identity of the performer. She was forced to hold her voice under settings that did not recur, as these appearances came one after another in spaces that were never the same. It was still work during the day, the stage at night. She carried songs that had not been prepared ahead of time in accordance with a set list as she made her way through roadside clubs and small bars. Every location has a different sound. The audience's distance from her was never constant, and attention may be diverted at any time. She didn't stick to a set style of singing. Instead, she made adjustments in real time, lengthening phrases, dropping notes, or switching songs when she felt the room was starting to fade. After every performance, what was left was the capacity to hold audiences' attention for longer. She entered an environment where it was performed on a weekly basis at the Moose Lodge in Brunswick, Maryland, when she went to audition with Bill Pear's band. She was standing on the same stage in front of faces that kept coming back and holding on to songs long enough for people to grow accustomed. Singing started to focus into a more distinct rhythm instead of being dispersed throughout several locations. The MC called out Patsy Cline's name during stage introductions, and then she increased her voice. Her association with Bill Peerin did not stay solely professional in that same setting. Time spent together, travels, and performances continued until old age. There was no distinct line between these parts, even if each was nonetheless constrained by their respective obligations. Both on-stage and off-stage events overlapped, with continuing in tandem with her movements and work. Her voice was introduced into a wider environment through appearances on regional television shows like Connie B, Gaze Town, and Country Time. She kept switching between stages, experimenting with new tunes, and making last-minute adjustments rather than depending on a predetermined structure. Every time she performed music in front of a microphone, she had to maintain